Hi guys, I hope you are doing well. So for today, you will learn about voluntary and involuntary actions. Students, there are three learning standards that you need to achieve at the end of this lesson. Okay? At the end of this lesson, you should be able to compare and contrast voluntary and involuntary actions. Describe the reflex actions involving two neurons and three neurons, and draw a reflex arc. Okay, now let's discuss about voluntary and involuntary actions. Okay, responses produced are either voluntary action or involuntary action. I have two questions for you. Okay, so my first question, okay, what are the pathways of information transmission involved in both actions? And then my second question is, what are the differences between voluntary action and involuntary action? This table shows comparison between voluntary and also involuntary action. So what is the similarity? Okay, both actions involve stimulation, impulse, neuron, and an effector organ. What are the differences? There are four differences shown in this table. So, for voluntary action, the actions that we are conscious of and done on our own will. Whereas for involuntary action, okay, the actions that occur automatically, okay, and occurs without us being conscious. Okay, and then for voluntary action, it involves the somatic nervous system, while for involuntary action, it involves the autonomous nervous system. And then voluntary action controlled by the cerebral cortex or cerebrum. Okay, and then for involuntary action, it is controlled by the medulla oblongata and hypothalamus. And lastly, for voluntary action, it involves the reaction of the skeletal muscles, whereas for involuntary action, it involves the reaction of the smooth muscle and glands. Voluntary actions involving skeletal muscles. Voluntary actions such as walking, talking, or brushing teeth are conscious actions. Okay, for example, you can voluntarily raise your hand to answer a question. The voluntary actions involving the skeletal muscles are controlled by the cerebral cortex. Since the information reaches the cerebral cortex, that is our level of consciousness, our perception of the surroundings can be produced. Okay, the information pathway in voluntary action is demonstrated in this figure. So at first, stimulus occurs when the teacher questions pupils. Means that teacher asks questions. Okay, and then the pupil's receptor receives the stimulus and transmits the nerve impulses to the cerebrum through the sensory neuron. Okay, through the sensory neuron. And then the cerebrum interprets the nerve impulse to be sent to the effector. As you can see from this figure, it involves relay neuron. Okay, so this relay neuron, this neuron sends nerve impulses from the sensory neuron to the central nervous system, which is brain, and from the central nervous system to the motor neuron. Okay, and then the effector, which is skeletal muscles, receives the information, that is sent through motor neuron. And lastly, finally, the pupil raises his hand to answer the questions. The question. Involuntary actions involving skeletal muscles, which is reflex response, that consists of 3 neuron reflex arc and 2 neuron reflex arc. Now let's take a look at 3 neuron reflex arc. Several situations require immediate and spontaneous action. For example, if you accidentally prick your finger on a sharp pin, you will move your finger immediately without much thought. So this action is known as reflex action. So a reflex action is a fast response to stimulus without being controlled by the brain. The reflex action of moving the finger from the sharp pin involves 3 neurons. Sensory neuron, relay neuron, and motor neuron. Communication between the neurons in the peripheral nervous system and the spinal cord. The nerve pathway involved in a reflex action is called the reflex arc. And this figure, shows 3 neurons reflex arc. So, at first, when a finger is pricked by a sharp pin, the sensory receptor, detects the stimulus and triggers a nerve impulse. And then the nerve impulse, is transmitted along sensory neuron to the spinal cord. So in the spinal cord, the nerve impulse is transferred from the sensory neuron, through the synapse, to the relay neuron, or in this diagram called interneuron. From the relay neuron, the nerve impulse is transferred to the motor neuron. And then the motor neuron transfers the nerve impulse from the spinal cord to the effector, which is muscle tissue, so that the finger can be moved quickly. This diagram shows 2 neuron reflex arc. Another reflex action is the knee jerk, or known as patellar reflex. This reflex uses the nerve pathway that involves only 2 neurons. I repeat, involves only 2 neurons. That is sensory neuron and motor neuron. It does not involve relay neuron. Sometimes, doctors test the effectiveness of someone's nerve system by tapping on the knee using a rubber hammer. Okay, this figure shows the reflex arch in the knee jerk involving two neurons, sensory neuron and motor neuron. At first, when the tendon below the kneecap is knocked by the rubber hammer, the quadriceps muscles stretches and stimulates the stretch receptors to trigger nerve impulses. Okay, and then the sensory neuron, transmits the nerve impulses to the motor neuron in the spinal cord. Okay, to the motor neuron in the spinal cord. The motor neuron then transmit. Okay, this motor neuron transmit impulses from the spinal cord to the quadriceps muscles. Okay, and then the quadriceps muscles, the quadriceps muscle contracts, causing the leg to jerk to the front. Okay, leg jerks forward. Why reflex actions important? Okay, reflex actions produces a quick involuntary response aimed to prevent injury in an individual. Okay, so reflex action produce spontaneous responses without waiting for instructions from the brain. And the additional time that is needed by the brain to analyze information before triggering a response can lead to serious injuries. Since reflex action involves the spinal cord, the brain can focus on high-level thinking.